Hey coaches, Coach Mitford here with Hoops from Home. I know that in these trying times, technology has become one key method by which we as coaches can learn a variety of different things online and enhance our professional development. Today's discussion is going to be with regards to timeouts. Uh, in any game, there's definitively going to be some timeouts in which you as coaches are going to call. Five of the areas for which we should be calling timeouts. The first one, obviously, is changing momentum. In any game, we want to change the momentum if we can in our own favor. Sometimes we need to slow it down, sometimes we need to speed it up. But in all, it comes down to our style of play as well. If the game is too slow for our style of play, we might need to speed it up by calling a timeout and try to reinforce those aspects to our athletes. The second one, change of strategy. A lot of the times, some teams will be required to change some form of strategy, whether or not it's going from a man to a zone, or even just changing the offensive style for which you're playing within the game itself. I think that changing the strategy is really key. One of my favorite quotes from a fellow colleague of ours, Shawnee Harley, former women's national team coach, assistant coach. She said, she knows if you always do what you've always done, you're always going to have the same result. And I really took that to heart because changing strategies is tough for a lot of coaches, but sometimes it's a necessity. Sometimes you need to really take those risks in order to ensure that your athletes have a lot of success. And if you're not willing to take those risks, chances are you're not going to reap the potential benefits. The third item is drawing up a play. I know a lot of coaches call timeouts and they're so excited and they're so exuberant with their athletes that they've wasted all their time high-fiving everybody instead of really focusing on the needs of the athletes and the needs of the team, and that being basically coming up with a play for which they can see some form of positive outcome once they get back in. A lot of this stuff can happen in practice if you're really particular in your practice planning and ensuring that you have something drawn up in advance. I know that's not how it always is the case. However, if you have something in advance that you have for a special play, a special item that you can throw in that timeout, I'd highly recommend it. Similarly, as a coach, I think we always want to have that perfection, that perfect play. But a lot of the time, athletes, we can't control some of those factors that the other team is going to do, as well as what some of the players on the court are going to do. So it's really important to understand that if it doesn't work out, it's not always a reflection on you as a coach, but more of a okay, this is what we need to focus on in our next practice, so that we can minimize the opportunity, the chances that the same action happens again. The fourth item, give players a rest. And a lot of the times in these long games, athletes get fatigued. It's knowledgeable. When you start to see the level of intensity go down, especially amongst your five athletes that you have out on the court, it might be a good time to call a timeout. Maybe get them that rest that they require, get them that water break that they need, or even potentially get that sub that you need into the game, all right? Just to create maybe that momentum change as I talked about in the first one, or just to give them that break so that you can get them back in, you can increase that intensity level once you come out of your timeout. The fifth item is to motivate your athletes, and it's really interesting when we talk about motivating our athletes. I know a lot of people are yellers, and some people are really calm in timeouts. I think you really have to know your athletes and what really drives them or motivates them. Not all athletes are created equal, so if you're going hard on one athlete, they might not respond the same way. So it's really important for you as a coach to really recognize and get into the in and outs of each of your athletes so that you understand what will motivate them in the timeouts. Don't take for granted the old school thinking that, if we're sitting there and you're going crazy on an athlete and you're really jacked, that's going to transfer onto your athletes, because it doesn't always do that. It's something that you really have to think about. Just some special considerations when you're talking about your timeouts as well. Do you have a plan? That's the biggest thing. I know a lot of coaches call timeouts, and one thing that kicks back to me is I had a coach one time, and that we were competing against, and he was yelling at his athletes in the timeout because I could overhear him, and he was like, "Do something out there, do something out there," and all I could do was reflect back on that one more. Well, what do you want your athletes to do? So whenever you're communicating with your athletes, make sure that you're really communicating what you need them to do. By sitting there and telling them over and over again, do something, you're not really giving them that specific feedback or that information. Similarly, if you're sitting there berating one of your athletes in that huddle, are all your athletes getting that information that they can actually go back on the court and be successful for what you want them to do? So just a couple things to think about there when you're dealing with your athlete. The other item is making sure that you understand, if you are drawing a play up, who do you need to get the ball to? What are you going to do to get that athlete the ball? What are you going to use as a distraction for your athlete so that, it might draw the defense away from this player? Or when you're going back out, what defense are you going to run? Are you going to run it one time? Or are you going to run it twice? When are you going to press? So those are just some special considerations when you're calling timeout. Have a plan for when your athletes come in. Just think about what you're going to call before you call your timeout. Think about, okay, what am I going to do? What do I want my main objective to be in this timeout? We've talked about the 5 different components, and those are, again, slowing momentum, changing strategy, drawing up a play, giving players a rest, and lastly, motivation. But make sure that you're really focused on a couple other things as well. And there's a lot as a coach, don't get me wrong. Shot clock. How much time is left in the shot clock? How much time is left in the game? That can play a role as to what you as a coach want your athletes to get out of it. One thing I was watching the other day, and it was interesting with coronavirus all going on right now and all the many things that are in our world right now. I was watching the Kentucky Duke game the other day, and it was interesting because Mike Krzyzewski made a big error in the second half of his game that actually probably cost him the game because he had called a timeout, and it was his last timeout, and there's probably about 8 or 9 minutes left in the game. Unfortunately for Krzyzewski, Kentucky decided to go on a run, and he couldn't stop it. He could not stop the run, and as a result, basically Kentucky came back from 17 points and ended up taking the lead and ended up winning in the last minute because Krzyzewski couldn't call a timeout and stop that run and that momentum. It just goes to show you sometimes you might want to save that one timeout for the last couple minutes of the game. As coaches in FIBA rules, we have those 3 timeouts, and maybe we should use them pretty wisely, or at least save that one. I like to do that. I might like to save it for at least the last 4 minutes, so that should something happen, at least I have that backup where I can call the timeout to push the ball up into the front court, or whether or not I need a special play in that last minute, or there's less time on the shot clock, and I need to set up a play to get a score. So just those little idiosyncrasies, and it happens to all of us as professionals. In this coaching industry, is that sometimes you learn by the mistakes of others, and this is coming from an individual who is basically making millions of dollars a year, and he unfortunately made a critical error that potentially could have cost him a national championship. So anyway, there's a lot of things to cover, but hopefully that gives you a little some ideas as to when you should call timeouts, some considerations in calling your timeouts, and how you can move forward. All the best. Stay safe. Stay healthy. My name is Coach Midford. All the best.